Reporting from Kingston, Ontario, I'm standing outside Bellevue House, the National Historic Site, which is supposed to be a monument to Sir John A. Macdonald, the founder of our country. The problem is, just like every other Macdonald monument across our country, this really isn't much of a monument, much of a shrine to Macdonald. It has been reopened after 6 years of being closed for repairs, and of course it went from being a legitimate monument of Macdonald to now being full of anti-Canadian propaganda. The tour of Bellevue House starts behind me in the Visitor Centre, and what's very strange about the Visitor Centre is that it's not really a story of Macdonald, but it's more a story of Canada starting at Macdonald. The facts, if you will, are in white text, the actual story, and then underneath it in purple text seems to be the reinterpretation of history. That's the Justin Trudeau-approved version of Canadian history, which really just says everyone was a racist, everyone was an evil colonizer, and the formation of Canada is itself illegitimate because it was all built on racism and colonialism. It goes from the Visitor Centre then to, of course, Bellevue House. Before I go any further, I have to say the tour guides that we had for Bellevue House were remarkably unbiased. They actually seemed to want to tell the truth about Macdonald. Of course, they had to read off part of a script about how bad John A. Macdonald is and how evil Victorian Canada was. But the rest of the tour was remarkably unbiased. The tour guides were fine. What you saw inside Bellevue House, however, was not. Welcome to the new and improved, decolonized Bellevue House. Before you get to the house, you will first see this sign with unattributed quotes about Sir John A. Macdonald. No surprise that the first quote you'll see is, "He was a monster." It seems that the most generous quote from an unknown source they could find was, "We wouldn't have Canada without him." The anti-Canadian propaganda begins immediately when you walk through the front door of Bellevue House. The tour begins with this sign, reminding you that you are invited into discussions and moments of personal reflection about how Canada's future can be more inclusive. As you will see, this isn't your typical museum. In the basement of the house, you will see a lexicon for the time, which includes words like genocide, imperialism, racism, and colonialism. On the main floor, when you walk into John A. Macdonald's kitchen, you can't help but notice this giant red sign telling you how the, quote, European occupation, unquote, caused significant harm to Indigenous diets. Remember, this is all John A. Macdonald's fault, which really means it's all your fault. When you walk up to the second floor of Bellevue House, well, that's when the decolonization really begins. Inside Bellevue House, John Jr., John A. Macdonald's youngest son, died at just 1 year old due to infant death syndrome. When you walk inside of John Jr.'s bedroom, well, that's when you're greeted with one of the most disgraceful things inside of this house. They've turned John Jr.'s bedroom into a memorial for residential school children, including this out-of-context quote from Macdonald, all designed to make you think that he was the worst person in this country's history. You then get to enter Macdonald's bedroom, where there is a giant flat-screen television above John A.'s bed playing videos about natives on repeat. Interesting, I didn't know flat-screen televisions were around in the 1850s. How historically accurate. The problem is, over the past few years, nearly every monument to Macdonald has been erased, starting here in Kingston. The Kingston City Council voted to remove John A. Macdonald's statue a few years ago. That was followed by similar actions in Charlottetown, who also voted to remove John A. Macdonald's statue. Again, followed by actions we've seen in Montreal, where his statue was violently torn down by a group of BLM activists. Since then, Montreal has decided that actually they won't put Macdonald's statue back in its place where it belongs. They'll just leave the pedestal there so that everyone can see the crime that was committed and not replaced. Regina, they voted to remove their John A. Macdonald statue. The city of Victoria, they also voted to remove John A. Macdonald statue. In Hamilton, they voted to remove John A. Macdonald statue. Queen's Faculty of Law here in Kingston, well, they took John A. Macdonald's name off their Faculty of Law building. Basically, every single monument to John A. Macdonald under Justin Trudeau's leadership has been erased. And if it hasn't been erased, it has been footnoted and qualified with things that, frankly, he wasn't that responsible for. Did anyone really expect anything different to come from the Bellevue House monument? It only opened just last week after 6 years of being closed. At the opening ceremony of Bellevue House just last week, We were reminded by one of the historians who was involved with putting up the new plaques and the new statements reminding us all how evil John A. was, that Canada is steeped in racism and colonialism.
Canada, like the United States, was steeped in racism, colonialism, white supremacy, and other legacies of enslavement.
We're now here, however, to ask local Kingstonians what they think of John A. Macdonald. Should John A. Macdonald be celebrated? Or should we continue this process of demonizing the greatest Canadian, the man responsible for our country? Let's see what they have to say.
I feel like we have to remember history and learn from it instead of just tearing it all down.
And do you think that Canada has a history that we should be proud of and not just be constantly feeling, apologizing and feeling bad for?
I think we have to learn from history.
Do you think that using today's standards, moral standards, to judge leaders in the past, say in the 1850s, 1860s, do you think that's a good way to approach history?
I mean, I feel like society was very different back then in the way that we had like different rules and different norms as to how society used to conduct. But again, the new norms that we have brought about, they are, much more suited to our way of life in the current milieu. So I feel like while we should not really vilify previous figures, we should also not glorify them and maybe keep it at like a middle point where we are not really glorifying them or vilifying them. Or maybe if we want to take an optimistic look, we could maybe just look at the achievements that they have made rather than look at them through a personal lens.
I feel like, say, some of the monuments that have came down, or them trying to maybe, if they're going to change some street names, I think we should hold on to our history, and we know what happened in the past, and we acknowledge some of the bad things that happened in the past, but we should still have our past, and history's important to our kids and to the future.
You think that it's important for Canada to protect our history and to not erase our history?
For sure.
Every inch of it. I think it's like people trying to make white people feel guilty.
You think the attacks on Macdonald have gone
too far? Like, you can't blame a guy that's the head of the country for something that came down that was of the time that he was in. A lot of people don't realize the natives at that time were under a lot of poverty. All good deeds do not go unpunished. So I don't mean to be disrespectful to any Indigenous people or anything at all, but we have to look at the times, the reasons. If you were looking at it from today's point of view, we're not looking at it from point of view from our past. I think it was Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau that said, and this was over, I think the Chinese being in they were asking for compensation, and he was going, you cannot hold this government responsible for something that happened 100 years ago, even if it is wrong. It's just that time is gone, and we can't make restitution to people that aren't here.
And do you think Canadians should be prouder of their country and more proud of where we come from?
I do. I find that there's a lot of woke stuff going on and a lot of mega stuff. We got to find the middle. It's either you believe what I believe or I'm against you. So you're either for me or against me, and we got to stop that. Because I was liberal when I was growing up, and now I find I'm more conservative. But my views haven't changed.
I think it's important for every country to protect their history, because you don't want to lose that for the next generation. So it's important to share and to preserve that.
Do you think that it's important to recognize the positives and not necessarily just the negatives?
Yeah, actually, I think we have to balance this thing, because you have to preserve the good things that one person do at their moment in the history. But actually, you have to recognize the bad things as well, because it's important for any kind of culture to grow with that thing and avoid to do the same things again over and over.